Today I want to talk a little bit about the debates that people have had and that people continue to have about the U.S. Constitution. Americans today seem to be fairly attached to their Constitution, but in 1787 and 1788 it was a hotly debated item. In pamphlets and newspapers across the states, partisans of the agreement achieved in Philadelphia and opponents of that agreement engaged in a bitter debate. You see, state assemblies still had to vote on what their representatives had hammered out in compromise, and the outcome of those votes was still in doubt. So what was at stake here? The Constitution, as it was ratified, does not actually grant that much power to the federal government. But the Anti-Federalists felt that it still gave too much power to the federal government. Most worryingly, they thought it did not include many express protections of individual liberty. It gave the government a fair number of powers, but it didn't seem to restrict it in any meaningful way. This expresses a kind of eternal conundrum, or this debate expresses a kind of eternal conundrum. How do you give governments enough power to pursue the common good, that is to say, overcome collective action problems, but also prevent it from trampling on important freedoms? It seems that once you give someone a tool or a power, they can use it however they want, and a paper document is not going to stop guns, armies, or paramilitary police forces. The ancient Romans said it pithily, as they often did, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who watches the watchers. The American answer to this question about who watches the watchers was threefold: separation of powers, checks and balances, and democratic accountability. First, separation of powers. Some say, if each part of government has authority over its area of expertise, then government will be more efficient. Well, that might be true, but that's not what the framers had in mind. Separation of powers was a way of making sure that all political power did not reside in a single place. Different functions of government would be housed in different so-called branches that were selected in different ways. Both Congress and the President were elected, though by somewhat different methods, and the courts were appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. This deliberately makes lawmaking less rapid and diminishes the pace of change. Checks and balances uses the separation of powers to make sure that each branch of government has some control over what the others are doing. The President can, for example, veto a law. The Senate has to approve presidential appointments, particularly to the court. The courts can review legislation from Congress and executive orders that the President gives. Congress can impeach the President, and the President nominates candidates for vacancies on the various courts, including the Supreme Court. So the separation of powers makes sure that no one has too much power, but the checks and balances make sure that the branches are accountable to one another. Political scientists call this horizontal accountability. Horizontal accountability is when different parts of government check one another, that is to say, oversee each other's performance and cannot act without the consent or advice of another part of government. Let's talk about democratic accountability. On top of each branch of government keeping an eye on one another, the people also get to keep a very tight leash on Congress, elected every 2 years, a medium leash on the President, elected every 4 years, a longer leash on senators, elected every 6 years, and a very long leash on the courts and the bureaucracy, who are appointed by the President, and in the case of the courts, serve for life. When the government is accountable to the people directly, you have what is called vertical accountability. Vertical accountability is just that, when government is accountable to the people. Now, talk about Federalist Number 10. Federalist Number 10 was a pamphlet written by James Madison, who eventually became the fourth president. And Federalist Number 10 explains how the proposed Constitution at the time it wasn't ratified will make it likely that government will pursue the public interest rather than the private interest of what he calls factions. Today we would call factions special interests, although in fairness he also talked about majority factions, that is to say factions that could be as large as a majority of the population, and that doesn't sound like a special interest. But even a majority can have, I guess, a partial interest against the interest of a minority. So what he's really trying to do is prevent private interests from triumphing over the common interest, that is to say, the good of everyone. We're all worried today, after all, that the government seems to be a free-for-all, where some well-connected minorities manage to extract revenue from the rest, right? Business interests, labor interests, whatever it might be, seem to be able to extract their pound of flesh, so to speak. Madison says that the way to stop this is to have a large-scale democracy, rather than a small-scale democracy. In a large-scale democracy, no local faction or interests will dominate in the way they can on a city or a state level. So, for example, debtors will not bully creditors, and creditors will not bully debtors. Or shipping interests will not dominate, industrial interests will not dominate agricultural interests, because each one of those quote-unquote factions that would be tempted to try to get legislation benefiting them at the expense of others will be checked and overbalanced by the other factions. So even though Wall Street and financial companies may be very powerful in the city of New York, as well as the state of Delaware, in the rest of the country still has enough votes to prevent them from abusing their local privileges. So Madison's idea was that representative democracy could protect liberty in a way that face-to-face democracy could not. And you have to understand that until now, the idea of democracy was understood very much as face-to-face democracy. In fact, Madison was not specifically advocating for a democracy. He wanted a large republic. And the idea of a republic was democracy, yes, but constrained by separation of powers and checks and balances. Okay. In a large-scale democracy, the idea was that the common good was likely to win the day, because again, factions would cancel one another out. Even if the common good did not win the day, Madison thought, laws benefiting only a minority would eventually get repealed. That is to say, even if mistakes were made, those mistakes were unlikely to endure if the government was ultimately accountable to a majority. So what emerged from these constitutional debates was a kind of compromise. The Federalists won the argument. The Federalists got their way. But the Anti-Federalists were able to extract some concessions out of the Federalists. In particular, a promise to pass a Bill of Rights, which Congress duly passed in September 1789, a year later. And this Bill of Rights not only imposed substantive constraints on what the government could do, but also imposed a philosophy of government known as the doctrine of enumerated powers, and this was in the 10th Amendment. So what this meant was that in addition to express restrictions on Congress, there was the affirmation in the 10th Amendment that the powers in the Constitution were the only powers that the government had. The rest were reserved to the states and the people. Right? So the idea was that if the Constitution did not grant the government or Congress or any branch of government the power to do something, then that power simply was not a power of the federal government. It was a power either of the states or of the people. That meant that if the president or Congress wanted to do something that was not specified in the Constitution, that was not an enumerated power, then the constitutional amendment would have to be passed. And once that constitutional amendment would be passed, then the doctrine of enumerated powers would be preserved. So, is this compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists still in effect? Well, yes and no. The Bill of Rights still mostly acts as a check, but the doctrine of enumerated powers effectively died in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt, during the New Deal era, threatened to increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court unless those justices stopped declaring the New Deal unconstitutional for want of the recognition in the Constitution that you could in fact do things like regulate prices or production or things like that. This is called the switch in time that saved 9. Today, only fairly conservative and libertarian citizens still hold the idea that government may only do what is specified in the Constitution. Most people just assume that the government can do whatever it wants, and within some broad limits, that's probably true. So next time you have a discussion forum, a discussion post to do, and the question is, how democratic is the Constitution? Sanford Levinson, in the article that you have to read for next time, argues that the Constitution is a bit of a mess. It more or less endorsed slavery, and it did really nothing for women or the poor, and because the Constitution is very difficult to change, that ensures that a small minority or the small minority interest can continue to defeat the will of the majority, because ultimately, in order to stop a constitutional amendment, you don't need very many votes. Lane and Oreskes, on the other hand, argue that a democracy is not just about the majority getting its way. It's a system that also preserves individual liberty, and this requires both enabling and disabling the majority, depending on what that majority is trying to do. In other words, their view is that the purpose of a democracy is to protect individual liberty, not to just give the majority whatever it wants. I look forward to hearing your view on this subject in the discussion forums.